Today at 6, still no governing executive in Northern Ireland, with new elections now on the cards. With no deal in sight at Stormont, major decisions on public services, including sorting out record NHS waiting lists, are still on hold. The Democratic Unionists are not happy with the post-Brexit trade arrangements, but the biggest party, Sinn Féin, says they are disrespecting the voters' wishes.
Back in May, people voted for change. They voted because they want politics to work. The electorate want grown-up politicians to take everyday challenges seriously, the things that impact on the lives of workers and families.
The barrier to devolution is not the DUP, it's the Northern Ireland Protocol. And when this is addressed, we are ready to form a new executive.
The legal deadline for a power-sharing coalition to be formed is midnight, but that's set to pass without a breakthrough.
Yes, we'll have the latest from Chris there in Stormont as business leaders warn that the stalemate is damaging Northern Ireland's economy. Also on the programme. The oil giant Shell enjoys the second highest quarterly profits on record, but it pays no windfall tax in the UK. A woman has been found guilty of the murder and decapitation of a friend in order to inherit her estate. A special report from the Norwegian Arctic, from a region that is warming more quickly than anywhere else on Earth. And the wall of poppies and veteran stories that heralds the start of remembrance.
On BBC London, some of the Met's newest recruits, but the new commissioner tells us he's prioritising quality over quantity as he aims to restore the force's reputation.
Good evening. After months of political deadlock in Northern Ireland, the situation is now at crisis point. The latest efforts to form a new governing executive have failed, so major decisions on public services, including sorting out record NHS waiting lists, are still on hold. Business leaders are saying that the political instability is damaging investment and job creation. Now, back in May, just a reminder, the Nationalist Party Sinn Féin, for the first time, won the biggest number of seats at the Stormont Assembly. And it's called on the DUP, who are in second place, to support the election of a speaker today so that a governing executive can be formed. But the DUP, which is the biggest unionist party, has so far refused because it believes that Northern Ireland's place in the UK is being undermined by the post-Brexit deal which was signed by Boris Johnson. Now, that deal, which is widely referred to as the Protocol, sets out the trading arrangements between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and goods being transported from there to there, well, they are subject to checks. If there's no deal by tonight, and there's no sign of one, new elections will be called probably for the 15th of December. And there are fears that a new set of elections could lead to more tensions. So for the latest, let's join our Ireland correspondent, Chris Page, at Stormont.
Yes, Hugh, just under 6 hours to go now until time officially runs out for Stormont. And in the past, deadlines in Northern Ireland politics have been known to come and go with little consequence, but it feels like it's not going to be like that this time. Today, most of the 90 members of the Devolved Assembly were back in their debating chamber for a couple of hours, but what happened only seemed to signal that an election is all but inevitable.
8 months have passed since Northern Ireland last had a functioning devolved government. At the start of another deadline day, the Democratic Unionist Party made clear the Stormont shutdown wouldn't be ending.
I have the backing of the people of Northern Ireland who voted for the DUP and gave us the mandate that we have to take the position that we hold. That's the backing that matters to me. And if we need to, we will go back to the people and we will seek to refresh and renew our mandate.
Arrangements will be set in place.
The other 4 main parties in the Assembly want power sharing to be restored immediately. As things stand, Michelle O'Neill of Sinn Féin is in line to be First Minister. In a special recall meeting, she accused the DUP of holding most voters to ransom.
Jeffrey Donaldson and the DUP are in a perpetual standoff with the public, the majority of whom they do not speak for or indeed represent. He stood for election, yet failed to show up. This is his mess and a failure of leadership by him and his party.
As expected, the DUP blocked the process to put in place a speaker.
Therefore, we can proceed no further.
The politicians who were elected only 5 months ago haven't had the opportunity to spend much time in the Assembly chamber. Now they're leaving it for the last time before the midnight deadline. It's likely that before Christmas they're going to have to ask people for their votes once again.
The political system in Northern Ireland is different to almost everywhere else. It's based on the Good Friday Peace Agreement, signed in 1998 after a long conflict. A majority of Unionists and Irish nationalists must agree to share power for a devolved government to be formed. The DUP says it won't join a coalition until the Brexit trade border in the Irish Sea is scrapped. In Belfast city centre, people don't seem to like the idea of going to the polls in December.
Waste of time.
Waste of time?
Yeah, because if the DUP don't partake, why have an election?
The cost of living is a disgrace, so definitely things need to change.
Would you be enthusiastic about voting again?
No, not one bit.
So will voters use the election to let off steam? This cafe owner is among thousands of business people here dealing with rising costs. She's largely lost faith in Northern Ireland's politics as another campaign comes closer.
To be brutally honest, I won't open the door because it's an absolute farce. I'm sick, sore and tired of the same thing over and over again. Absolutely nothing changes, and yet again it's businesses in Northern Ireland. We're a small business economy who are keeping Northern Ireland working. We are in Groundhog Day again, having an election for what outcome?
There's no sign of any last-minute change of direction. It's almost inevitable that as autumn turns into winter, the ballot box will beckon.
That was Chris Page there reporting on the latest developments at Stormont. Let's go to Westminster and talk to Ione Wells, our political correspondent. Ione, all the talk, of course, about the protocol. The unionists want the protocol to be changed. Is there any prospect of that happening?
Well, that's right, Hugh. Rishi Sunak has urged the DUP to return to the government in Stormont with number 10 saying that the people of Northern Ireland deserve a functioning government. But the reason they're not is issues over this Northern Ireland Protocol, that post-Brexit treaty essentially keeping Northern Ireland in the EU's single market. The question is, will any of those issues be resolved? Now, the key demand from the UK side is they want a loosening of checks on goods travelling from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. They also want changes to things like tax arrangements and government support for businesses in Northern Ireland to bring that more in line with ones in Great Britain. Now, the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, today spoke to his EU counterpart. They will continue talking, but if those talks fail, there is a new law passing through the Westminster Parliament here, which would allow essentially ministers to override key parts of that protocol. Now, the EU think that this is illegal and have hinted they could introduce trade retaliations in response. The key question now for the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, is would he be willing to plough ahead with that law, risk escalating tensions, or would he be more keen to compromise?
Ione, thanks very much again for the latest thoughts there at Westminster. Ione Wells. Now, the oil giant Shell has paid nothing in windfall tax in the UK, despite making global profits of nearly £26 billion so far this year. Rishi Sunak, who of course took over as Prime Minister on Tuesday, had introduced the Energy Profits Levy in May when he was Chancellor to help pay for support for British households hit by the cost of living crisis. Well, let's join our business editor, Simon Jack, who has more details. Hi, Simon.
Thank you, Hugh. Yes, those same high oil and gas prices that are squeezing households and businesses are creating bumper profits of the companies that sell it. Companies like Shell, which made £8.2 billion in the 3 months at the end of September alone. That's more than double what it made in the same period last year. And so far this year, it's made £26 billion. And here's why. This is the oil price. You can see here the spike just after Russia invaded Ukraine, and it's remained high for several months before recently falling back. But this is the real horror show. This is gas, and you can see it's been shooting up to 8 or even 10 times its long-term average price. And companies like Shell are prospering from circumstances and prices they don't control and didn't expect. So little wonder there are calls to tax these massive profits.
Families will find this obscene. They're really struggling. They're considering, how do we turn off the heating? How do we keep a roof over our children's head and food on the tables this winter? And that's why the government has to act. No more excuses. Impose a higher windfall tax.
But it's not straightforward. The vast majority, almost all of Shell's income and profits come from outside the UK. They have operations in 70 countries, and those operations are taxed in those countries. On their UK operations, they, in theory, face much higher taxes than normal. 30% in corporation tax, 10% special oil and gas levy, and recently a 25% windfall tax, 65% in total. However, on paper, Shell hasn't made a profit in the UK since 2017, as it perfectly legally offsets costs to decommission oil rigs and can further offset the recent windfall tax by investing in new UK energy. And over the next decade, Shell has said it will invest £20 to £25 billion in the UK, 3/4 of that in low or zero carbon energy. But they're also dishing out vast sums to shareholders, which include pension funds. They announced a 15% rise in their annual dividend today and a further £3.5 billion in extra payouts. Watching that kind of money paid out from a UK headquartered company in a time of a cost of living crisis generates bafflement and outrage that there are not simple answers to sometimes complex problems. Hugh.
Simon, many thanks again. Simon Jack, our business editor. A woman has been found guilty of the decapitation and murder of a friend in order to inherit her estate. Gemma Mitchell killed Mi Quen Chong at her home in northwest London in June last year before putting her body into a suitcase and then disposing of it. Our correspondent Helena Wilkinson has more details.
This is Gemma Mitchell leaving her home, which is in a desperate state of disrepair. She needs money to fix it. She's dragging a suitcase which she'll use hours later to put her friend's body inside after having murdered her for financial gain. Mi Quen Chong, known as Deborah to friends, met Mitchell through the church. After Mitchell murdered Miss Chong, she kept her body for 15 days. She then drove more than 200 miles to the picturesque resort of Salcombe in Devon, where she dumped it in woodland. Charlotte Rollings was with family on holiday when they found the body.
Go ahead, caller. What's your emergency? I just found the body. Are they breathing? No, they're dead. They look like they've possibly been there like a few days.
Police! And this was the moment Mitchell was arrested.
All right, Gemma, at this moment, I'm arresting you on suspicion of murder.
The car stank, didn't it, Gemma?
When in custody and questioned by police, Mitchell said no comment throughout. The court heard Miss Chong had offered Mitchell £200,000 to help repair her home, but backed out of the offer. Shortly afterwards, she disappeared. Mitchell, after killing her friend, then forged Miss Chong's will so that she and her mother would receive her estate.
It was an evil act carried out by an evil woman, and the only motive clearly was one of financial gain.
During the trial, jurors heard Mitchell had a degree in human sciences and had the skills to dismember a body.
Should I get some shoes?
Mitchell will be sentenced tomorrow for the cold and calculated murder of her friend for money. Helena Wilkinson, BBC News.
The number of crimes in England and Wales that result in someone being charged is now half of what it was 7 years ago. Figures released today show that the proportion of crimes reported to police that result in a charge has fallen from just over 15% in March of 2015 to just over 5% now. Here's our Home Affairs correspondent Daniel Sanford with more details.
The good news is that on the best official estimates, the number of crimes in England and Wales is still lower than it was before the pandemic. But the bad news is that while we're actually reporting more crimes, fewer people are being charged with those offences by the police. Here's a graph of the number of crimes reported to the police over the last 7 years, rising from around 3.5 million to around 5.5 million. So what's been the outcome of those crimes? Well, back in 2015, just short of 600,000 of them ended up with somebody being charged, around 15.5%. But as the number of crimes reported rose, the number of people being charged fell. In the year to June, it was less than 300,000, around 5.4%. And for theft and sexual offences, including rape, it's even lower, the Home Secretary has demanded that police forces improve their charge rates. It's not clear why it's happening. One explanation might be the police cuts that started in 2010 and continued on until 2018. But police numbers have been rising since then, while the number of offences leading to a charge has continued to fall. So what does happen to the crimes we report to the police? Well, it used to be that in almost half of all cases, no suspect was identified. That number's been falling and is now about a third. But while that's been going down, the number of cases in which police say the victim wants no more action to be taken has been going up. It raises the suspicion that these are just convenient ways of closing cases that forces have not got enough resources to investigate.
That was Daniel Sanford there, Home Affairs correspondent. Time is 6:15 and our main story this evening. There is still no governing executive in Northern Ireland, with new elections now on the cards. And coming up a little later, yet more criticism of Qatar's human rights record ahead of the hosting of this year's Football World Cup.
And at 6:30, we meet the London bus driver who ferried medical supplies to Ukraine. And the row over natural afro hairstyles. A watchdog says schools which ban them may be acting illegally.
There is no credible pathway to keep the rise in global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius, according to a new UN assessment. The latest global summit on climate change will start next week in Egypt, with concerns among experts that governments will try to avoid making further commitments to cut carbon emissions. Today, the government here announced that the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak would not be attending that summit. One place where the impact of climate change is being felt very harshly is Svalbard in the Arctic Circle. The Norwegian islands are warming more quickly than any other place on Earth. Our correspondent Nick Beak has sent this special report.
Venture deep into the Arctic Circle and you find Svalbard. There's no place quite like it. And here, a struggle for survival. Climate change is on fast forward. Polar explorer Hilda Farmström wants to show us how her world is disappearing. Soon, an incredible sight, but one framed with sadness.
To survive as a polar bear now, I think you have to be super good at hunting, because the main source of food, the seals, they are diminishing, and the ice that both the seal and the polar bears are dependent on are diminishing. It's getting less and less ice.
This Norwegian archipelago is warming 6 times faster than the global average. There's much less ice here to reflect heat and more exposed ocean to absorb it.
These beluga whales, they're swimming in water that's much hotter than it used to be. And all wildlife here in Svalbard is having to adapt to this hotter world. You can hear them now. It's hotter in the water and it's hotter in the air too.
Melting here raises sea levels and affects weather patterns across the globe. In what is the northernmost settlement in the world, it's life on the edge. Houses are being moved and rebuilt, new barriers installed to stop more avalanches triggered by the thawing ground.
Wherever I look around us, I see change.
And leading polar scientist Kim Holloman tells us the war in Ukraine is now undermining the effort to understand climate change.
The official exchange with Russian institutions is not possible at this time. Half of the Arctic is Russian coastline. And if we are unable to share knowledge and data, it will hamper our ability to understand what is happening. It will. We need each other in order to do good science.
Svalbard attracts tens of thousands of visitors every year, putting further strain on this fragile environment. But the authorities claim they're moving towards renewable energy.
Now we are in one of the 2 production sites we have here in mine number 7. We are 8 kilometers in the mine.
This is Svalbard and Norway's last coal mine, which we're told is due to close.
It makes me sad. It was a mining town, and now it's coming to an end. It's more and more of a tourist town.
But just a fortnight after our visit, the state-owned company announces it's delaying the closure. Why? It says Europe's energy crisis now makes the mine a more profitable operation. If they can't give up fossil fuels in the fastest warming place on Earth, what hope for the rest? The UN says we face a climate emergency. The alarm is sounding. We ignore it at our peril. Nick Beake, BBC News, in the Arctic Circle.
Now, in Russia, President Putin has warned that the coming decade will be the most dangerous and unpredictable since the end of the Second World War. Speaking in Moscow, he defended Russia's actions in Ukraine, and he accused the former UK Prime Minister Liz Truss of being crazy to talk about the use of nuclear weapons. Our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg is in Moscow and listened to the lengthy event. Steve, was there anything that you thought was more remarkable about President Putin's remarks than the ones he's made before?
Well, I think it's clear, Hugh, this is a leader who has no regrets, no remorse. There's no hint of a U-turn from the Kremlin leader. What we saw and heard today was the world according to Vladimir Putin, and it is a world in which he is right, he is squeaky clean, and his opponents are wrong, are to blame. For example, he accused the West of igniting the war in Ukraine. He said a new world order was emerging that should be based on law and justice. This from the president who invaded a sovereign independent nation back in February. And he said that Russia had been wrongly accused of threatening to use nuclear weapons in this conflict, when in fact, since February, on many occasions, Vladimir Putin has dropped unsubtle hints that he would be prepared to use all the weapons in Russia's arsenal in this conflict. But the most telling comment, I think, came when he said about the costs of the operation. He said, "I'm always thinking of the human lives lost." That was all he said about that, before talking about the enormous benefits to Russia from his special military operation here.
Steve, many thanks again. Steve Rosenberg, our Russia editor in Moscow. Well, despite the ruthless response of the security forces, the protests in Iran seem to be escalating. Overnight, thousands turned out to mark 40 days since the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, who died in police custody after being arrested for not wearing a hijab properly. The protests have now grown to be a wider rejection of the hardline government of Iran. The BBC's Samira Hussain has been speaking to one protester who's now fled the country, is in Pakistan, hoping to travel to the US. And to protect him, the BBC has concealed his identity.
41 days since the death of Mahsa Amini and 41 days of demonstrations across Iran. This is the city of Saqqez, Mahsa's home, and now her final resting place. Yesterday, authorities tried but failed to block protesters flocking to her grave to mark the end of the mourning period, a culturally significant moment for Iranians. Thousands continue to pour into the streets in protest against the authoritarian regime. One of those in the thick of the demonstrations was Moin. He was in the capital Tehran when the uprising began.
There are protests almost every other day, and they are getting suppressed violently. And even if you're not a protester, you might get some of the shrapnels. You might get beaten up, or I know of some people who have even gotten killed.
Tell me about that.
There's been regular shooting. I've seen the suppression forces beating people for the sake of just beating them up. It feels like they're trying to intimidate people, make other people think twice before taking to the street, which, you know, has been an effective tactic in the past. It doesn't seem to be working as much this time.
Why did you want to protest?
That could have easily been my sister. That could have easily been my girlfriend. Yes, I need to bear some risks, but I need to do it for the safety of my people.
The attempts to suppress the rage and anger of Iranians are violent and deadly. First-hand accounts such as Moin's and videos shared on social media show a country bristling with defiance. After decades under authoritarian rule, the people seem determined for regime change. Samir Hussain, BBC News, Islamabad.
Just a few weeks to go then, before the World Cup kicks off in Qatar. The Australian squad have released a collective statement against Qatar's human rights record, the first side to do so in this competition. The video message criticises the treatment of migrant workers and of the LGBTQ+ community. Campaigners in the UK say that they don't think anyone from those communities should be travelling to watch the World Cup in Qatar. Ollie Foster has this report.
And now Mbappe with a shooting chance!
In just under a month, France will start their World Cup defence. The champions will play Australia first in Qatar.
There are universal values that should define football.
And the Socceroos are the first team to collectively criticise the Gulf state on its human rights record.
Over the last 2 years, we have been on a journey to understand and learn more about the situation in Qatar.
As players, we fully support the rights of the LGBTI+ people. But in Qatar, people are not free to love the person that they choose.
Qatar's Supreme Committee have commended those players. They say no country's perfect, but this World Cup, they say, has contributed to a legacy of progress, better practice and improving lives. And it's a legacy that will live long after the final ball is kicked.
I'm not aware of a single out gay football fan that wants to go.
3 years ago, Paul Aman and his husband were invited to Qatar by the organisers, but they won't be returning.
To go into a country where on the statute they have the death penalty for being gay was not an easy thing to contemplate in the first instance. Nobody is interested in going, and all the different groups are reporting the same issues.
Earlier this week, after the campaigner Peter Tatchell says he was arrested for staging the first LGBT protest in the country, the Foreign Secretary James Cleverly was criticised for saying that gay fans would have to respect Qatari values.
They've continued to oppress LGBT+ people in their own country, forcing people into exile, forcing people to endure conversion therapy, which is basically torture, and jailing others. It's just such a state of disgrace that the World Cup is being held there.
Qatar have denied such claims for over a decade, and though the attention will shift towards the football next month, the spotlight on the country's human rights record hasn't dimmed. Ollie Foster, BBC News.
Well, the annual Poppy Appeal has been launched by the Royal British Legion with about a fortnight to go to the events of Remembrance Day on the 11th of November. And already there is an impressive space in central London decked with poppies where people are discovering stories of service personnel. Our correspondent Graham Satchell has this report.
See, that's all it needs to be said.
Veterans in front of a wall of poppies on the south bank of the River Thames. This the official launch of the annual Royal British Legion Appeal. Look a little closer and as the poppies are removed, they reveal extraordinary stories of bravery, sacrifice and heartache. Kingsman Anthony Cooper was on patrol in Afghanistan in 2010 when his life changed forever.
I remember the track I was going down, while going down it, and then a click. And that's it.
Anthony had stepped on an explosive device. He lost both his legs and his right eye.
It's very important that we remember. I lost 3 really good friends in Afghanistan, so I'll be remembering them, and I'll be remembering the fallen from the past as well.
Chantel's husband Ryan was a medic in Afghanistan. His life fell apart when he came home.
Before Ryan went, he was easygoing, lovely family man, everything over his head. And then when he come back, it would come back in the November, so it was firework night, so he'd be hiding under tables, he'd be really jumpy. He used to think he was back on that war zone. And then on November the 10th, Ryan had took his own life and committed suicide. Me and my eldest daughter found him hanging in the garage.
Chantel turned to the British Legion for help. They have given her practical and emotional support. What do you think of the Royal British Legion?
They're amazing, absolutely amazing. I can't thank them enough for all the support that we've received.
Bernard Morgan signed up for the RAF on his 18th birthday. He was part of the invasion of northern France in June 1944.
We landed in the afternoon of D-Day at 6:30 p.m. and it was sad to see all the dead bodies lying on the beach, which had arrived with the morning invasion part. and they were the first dead bodies I'd ever seen, and it was a very sad sight. The younger generation must be told of what went on all these years ago, and it's also to pay tribute to the sailors, soldiers, airmen and civilians who gave their lives for the freedom that we enjoy today.
That was 98-year-old Bernard Morgan, ending that report by Graham Satchell. Time is 6:30 and we're going to catch up with the weather. Here's Nick Heinig.
Hugh, a big number weather day out there today. 21 degrees Celsius, the top temperature in London. This is not just southeast England warmth at the moment, quite widely. We've been into the high teens today, so 18 in Blackpool and Edinburgh. Second column here is the average for the time of year, the long-term average. Clearly we're well above that. We will be for the rest of the month. And of course we have a dilemma now. Concerns about climate change, short-term benefits of not having to have the heating on as much with temperatures as high as this. And you must know by now we are dragging the air in from a long way south of the UK. Along with that though, with low pressure anchored to the west of us, we are seeing spells of wet and windy weather out there. We have another one coming in tonight, sweeping the wet weather through into tomorrow morning and then clearing to sunny spells and just a chance of a shower. Bit of patchy rain in Scotland at the moment, that will tend to clear away northwards. Here comes the wetter weather after midnight, especially for Northern Ireland, running into western Scotland tomorrow morning. A risk of some flooding and disruption, coastal gales developing in the west, and another very mild night out there. So tomorrow morning then, wet already in the west. That rain continues to feed north and east, not too much at all for East Anglia and southeast England. Behind it, it clears away from all but northern Scotland and the Northern Isles for an afternoon of sunny spells, largely dry, just a chance of a shower. It's a windier day out there. These are the wind gusts, and from North Wales northwards we get 50-mile-an-hour gusts in places, perhaps into the afternoon, 60 miles an hour in northern Scotland. A little bit cooler perhaps, we're not going to notice too much of a difference, still very mild out there. Same weather pattern continues into the weekend, largely fine on Friday evening, but then going into Saturday we'll see more wet weather heading in from the west, and so low pressure very much in control. So it does mean it's mild, it's wet at times at the weekend, windy at times too, a gradual cool down into next week, Hugh.
Nick, many thanks. That is BBC News at 6 on Thursday, the 27th of October. You can keep up to date with all the latest developments, of course, on the BBC News website. But from the 6 team, thanks for watching. And it's bye for now, because the news continues on BBC One with our colleagues in the nations and regions. So maybe I'll see you later at 10. Goodbye.